Engines roared like lions in the private parking lot of Orion Tower, every luxury car gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But one of them, a sleek black sports car worth more than most houses, sat stubbornly silent. Its owner, CEO Victor Harlow, stood beside it, furious. His engineers had tried. His assistants had tried. Even a professional mechanic had been rushed in. Nothing worked. The engine refused to obey. Around him, investors chuckled behind polished shoes and expensive watches. All that money, one whispered, and he can't even start his car. Victor's face burned red. He barked orders, his pride unraveling with each failed attempt. Then came a voice, quiet, calm, almost out of place. "I can fix it," said Samuel, the janitor, broom still in hand. Heads turned. Laughter erupted. A janitor? Fixing what certified mechanics could not? Victor sneered, waving him off. But Samuel didn't flinch. His eyes rested on the hood with the focus of someone who had known engines his entire life. 5 minutes, he added softly. That's all I need. The crowd roared with disbelief, already savoring the humiliation they assumed would follow. Yet none of them realized the truth. The man they mocked was about to deliver the fastest, most humbling victory they had ever seen. The luxury parking lot of Orion Tower became a stage that afternoon, and Victor Harlow, the CEO, was the unwilling star of a performance he couldn't control. His prized sports car, a marvel of European engineering, refused to start, its sleek hood mocking him with every futile turn of the ignition. Assistants scurried, phones pressed to their ears, summoning every specialist they could find. Investors, waiting for a meeting that was supposed to showcase Victor's dominance, now leaned against their own expensive cars, murmuring with barely contained amusement. The first mechanic arrived in a rush, his toolbox clattering as he hurried to the vehicle. He plugged in diagnostic equipment, tapped at a tablet, and announced with misplaced confidence, "It's a software glitch. I'll reset the system." 10 minutes later, sweat dripping down his forehead, he shook his head. Strange. It won't respond. Another expert was called. And another. Each one promised a solution, each one failed. Time stretched on, and so did Victor's humiliation. "Money can buy anything," Victor snapped, pacing in front of the car. "So fix it. Now." But money wasn't working. Every failed attempt chipped away at his towering pride. Whispers turned into chuckles. One investor smirked, "Seems the car mirrors the owner, flashy on the outside, but not working under the hood." Laughter followed, sharp as knives. And through it all, Samuel pushed his broom in the far corner of the garage. Invisible. The janitor who polished the marble floors that men like Victor strutted on. His uniform was faded, his shoes worn, his posture humble. He had been sweeping quietly since the commotion began, watching the parade of failures with calm eyes. He knew engines. He could hear problems in the rhythm of a misfiring system, feel them in the vibration of a stubborn part. Where others saw complexity, he saw patterns. Still, he said nothing. This was not his place. Until he couldn't hold it anymore. When the third mechanic packed up in defeat, Victor's fury exploded. "Useless. All of you, useless." He slammed the hood shut, his face crimson. That was when Samuel spoke. "I can fix it." His voice was steady, not loud, but it carried across the garage like a challenge. Every head turned. Silence broke into mocking laughter. One of the investors grinned cruelly. "The janitor? You mean to tell me the man with the mop will do what experts couldn't?" Victor's glare fell on Samuel. "Stay in your lane," he growled. "This isn't a toy engine, old man." Samuel didn't waver. He set the broom against the wall, wiped his hands on his uniform, and met the CEO's scorn with quiet eyes. 5 minutes, he said softly. "That's all I need." The crowd erupted again, jokes flying fast. "Careful, he might use duct tape. Maybe he'll sweep the engine clean." The laughter rolled on, feeding Victor's wounded pride. The CEO smirked, sensing an opportunity to reclaim dominance. "Fine," he spat. "Let's see you embarrass yourself. If you fail, you're fired on the spot." Gasps spread among the employees who had gathered nearby. The stakes had been set. Samuel only nodded. Understood. The investors leaned in, savoring the spectacle. They saw no risk, only entertainment, watching a janitor tumble deeper into humiliation. None of them believed. Not one thought he could do it. To them, Samuel was nothing more than a shadow, a man who existed only to sweep up after their triumphs. But as Samuel walked toward the car, something shifted. His shoulders straightened. His steps slowed, deliberate, measured. The laughter still echoed, but he didn't hear it. All he heard was the quiet hum of the machine, a language only he seemed to understand. He ran his calloused hand across the hood, listening, sensing. Years of forgotten experience stirred awake inside him. Victor crossed his arms, smirking. 5 minutes. Impress me. The janitor didn't answer. He simply opened the hood, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The challenge had been set. The humiliation was at its peak. And in that moment, everyone expected the janitor to fall. They had no idea that the man they scorned was about to turn their world upside down. The tension in the parking lot had reached its peak. The CEO's car stood motionless, a monument to arrogance and disbelief. The investors whispered nervously, the assistants shuffled their feet, and the janitor stood there, calm and steady, his toolbox resting quietly at his side. He had just offered to do what no one else could, fix the engine in minutes. But before we see what happens next, let me pause for just a second. Stories like this aren't just about engines or broken machines, they're about hidden talents, about the strength that lies behind humility, and about the way the underestimated can rise to shine when no one expects it. And if you're enjoying this journey, if you believe in second chances, in humble heroes, and in the power of the unexpected, then now is the perfect moment to join us. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of this community that values stories where justice flips the script. Your support helps us bring even more tales of courage and quiet strength to life. Alright, let's get back to that parking lot, where the janitor is about to show everyone just how much he knows. The parking lot had fallen into a silence so sharp it almost rang in the ears. The CEO crossed his arms, his sharp suit immaculate under the afternoon sun, his expression caught between skepticism and annoyance. A few investors chuckled quietly, trading glances that said, "This will be amusing." They expected the janitor to embarrass himself, to prove their prejudices right. But Daniel, the janitor, didn't flinch. His posture was calm, deliberate, like a man who knew engines the way some knew their own heartbeat. He knelt down by the luxury car, his hand steady as he popped open the toolbox he had carried like an old friend. The tools weren't flashy, no polished chrome or expensive sets. Just worn, reliable instruments that had seen countless fixes over the years. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms scarred with the memory of hard labor, hands strong yet precise. The CEO scoffed. 5 minutes? That's what you said? You'll waste 5 minutes of our time. Daniel didn't answer with words. He simply gave a small nod and turned his attention to the engine. As the hood lifted, a collective murmur spread. The investors leaned in, curious despite themselves. The machine was a tangle of wires, tubes, and polished steel, its failure puzzling even the dealership's technicians just hours before. But Daniel's eyes scanned it with quiet certainty. He placed one hand on the edge, leaned in, and began checking connections as if following a map only he could read. Loose wire here, a valve out of alignment there, details invisible to the untrained eye. His movements carried a rhythm, an unspoken confidence. Within moments, he had isolated the issue, a faulty sensor interfering with the fuel injection system. He pulled a wrench from his box, the metal clinking softly. The CEO tapped his watch impatiently. 2 minutes gone, he muttered loudly, making sure the crowd heard him. But Daniel didn't rise to the bait. He unscrewed a small component, inspected it under the light, then set it aside with the precision of a surgeon. The investors' whispers grew louder now, some leaning toward fascination. They couldn't deny the man's poise. His every move radiated the kind of mastery that came from years of hands-on experience, something money couldn't buy. One assistant, unable to contain her curiosity, whispered, He looks like he actually knows what he's doing." The CEO glared at her but said nothing. Daniel reconnected a wire, tightened a bolt, and adjusted the sensor. Each step was quick, decisive. He worked with the speed of someone who had done this countless times in less than ideal conditions. Grease stained his hands, but his touch was delicate, almost reverent, as though machines were old friends whispering their secrets only to him. At the 4-minute mark, he paused, wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt, and looked at the engine with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman finishing his work. He stepped back, signaling with a simple gesture for someone to start the ignition. The CEO rolled his eyes but climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key. For a split second, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, the engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, like a beast awakened. Gasps rippled through the group. Some investors even clapped instinctively before catching themselves. Daniel didn't smile. He just nodded once, almost to himself, as if this outcome had never been in doubt. His 5 minutes were up, and he had delivered exactly what he promised. But this was only the beginning. The ripple effect of this moment was about to transform everything. The whispers of doubt would soon turn into questions of awe, and the CEO who had mocked him would have no choice but to confront the truth standing before him. The engine's roar seemed to echo across the parking lot, louder than it should have been, because it carried with it the weight of shattered arrogance. The CEO sat frozen in the driver's seat, his perfectly rehearsed smirk gone, replaced by a stunned silence. The investors, once amused, now exchanged glances of disbelief. They had all witnessed something that should have been impossible, a janitor fixing in 5 minutes what certified mechanics had failed to solve in hours. One of the investors finally broke the silence. "That was extraordinary." His voice was low, almost reverent. Another nodded, his eyes narrowing as though reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the man in coveralls standing before them. Daniel, still calm, simply wiped his hands again and began placing his tools back into the battered toolbox. He didn't bask in the attention. He didn't gloat. To him, this was just another repair, another machine whispering its secrets. But to everyone else, it was a revelation. The CEO climbed out of the car slowly, trying to recover some semblance of authority. You must have studied engineering," he stammered, his voice carrying more insecurity than command. "Where? MIT? Stanford?" Daniel shook his head. "Life," he said simply. "And a lot of broken engines." The simplicity of his reply hit harder than any boast could have. The investors whispered again, this time with admiration. They weren't just impressed with the repair, they were captivated by the humility. In a world where arrogance usually filled the air, Daniel's quiet strength cut through like a blade. A senior investor, older and sharper than the rest, stepped forward. "Do you realize what this means?" he said to the CEO, though his eyes never left Daniel. "You dismissed him because of a uniform. You mocked him because of his title. Yet he accomplished what your hired experts couldn't. If this is how you run your company, no wonder you're having trouble convincing us." The word struck like lightning. The CEO paled. For the first time, his power seemed fragile, slipping through his fingers in front of the very people whose approval he desperately needed. Daniel quietly closed his toolbox with a soft click. He didn't need to say another word, his actions had already spoken volumes. But the room, metaphorically and literally, had shifted. The hierarchy had been flipped. The janitor was no longer invisible. He was undeniable. One assistant whispered under her breath, but loud enough for others to hear, 5 minutes. That's all it took to expose everything. The investors began to murmur in agreement. Their admiration wasn't just for the repair, but for the man who carried himself with such dignity in the face of mockery. In their eyes, Daniel represented something rare, competence without arrogance, talent without ego. The CEO, still scrambling, attempted one last recovery. "Perhaps we can discuss an arrangement," he said awkwardly, gesturing vaguely toward Daniel. "Someone with your skills." But Daniel cut him off gently, with a shake of his head. "I'm not here for arrangements," he said softly. "I just fixed what was broken." The investors caught the deeper meaning. It wasn't just the engine that was broken, it was the pride, the leadership, the very culture that had mocked the people who kept the world running quietly behind the scenes. The moment solidified itself as legend in that parking lot. A janitor had not only repaired a machine but had dismantled arrogance in front of the highest echelons of power. And the echoes of that lesson would not fade easily. As Daniel walked away, toolbox in hand, the investors watched him with something close to reverence. The CEO remained behind, his authority cracked, his arrogance exposed for all to see. And everyone present knew, the balance of power had shifted forever. The murmurs of the investors swelled into something undeniable, a wave of recognition that the balance of respect had shifted. No longer was Daniel simply the man who swept floors and emptied bins. Now, in their eyes, he was the man who had humbled arrogance with nothing but quiet skill. The engine purred steadily behind them, a living testament to his 5 minutes of mastery. The CEO stood rigid, still trying to salvage what remained of his image. His gaze darted from investor to investor, searching for support. But the faces that once hung on his every word now turned toward Daniel, their expressions filled with curiosity and respect. The silence between them cut deeper than any insult. It was the silence of lost credibility. One of the younger investors leaned toward another and whispered, "How many other talents has he ignored because they didn't fit his idea of worth?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered yet damning. Daniel, however, didn't revel in the downfall. He wasn't a man who thrived on vengeance. He simply nodded at the group, wiped the last of the grease from his fingers, and began walking back toward the maintenance shed. For him, this wasn't about recognition, it was about doing what needed to be done. But justice has its way of unfolding, even when the humble don't demand it. The senior investor who had spoken earlier turned back to the CEO. "I think we've seen enough today. You can talk numbers all you want, but leadership isn't about charts and suits, it's about recognizing people, their value, their skills. If you can't see that, then perhaps we should reconsider our partnership." The CEO's mouth opened, then closed again. The words he once wielded so confidently failed him now. He stammered, "This is a misunderstanding." But the investors weren't convinced. The broken engine had become a symbol, and Daniel's 5-minute fix had turned into a parable. They saw the arrogance, the dismissal, and the blindness for what they were. And they couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, Daniel reached the shed, placed his toolbox back on the shelf, and washed his hands at the small sink in the corner. The cool water ran over his calloused palms, carrying away the grease but leaving behind the strength of a man who knew his worth, even if others didn't. He didn't need applause. The work spoke for itself. Back in the lot, the investors were making decisions. One by one, they voiced their concerns about the CEO's leadership. Some mentioned the company's numbers, others brought up past missteps. But all of them, without exception, circled back to what they had just witnessed, the arrogance of mocking a janitor, and the blindness of underestimating someone who held real knowledge. The CEO grew paler with each comment. His empire, so carefully constructed on image and intimidation, was crumbling before his eyes. And though Daniel wasn't there to see it, the karmic justice was playing out in real time. By the time the meeting adjourned, the investors had reached an unspoken consensus. They wouldn't be walking away with empty promises. They wanted change. Real change. Later that evening, as Daniel was finishing his shift, one of the investors approached him quietly. He was an older man, his suit impeccable, his demeanor respectful. "You may not realize this," he said, "but today you changed more than an engine. You reminded us all what real competence looks like. Don't ever think your role makes you small." Daniel gave a polite nod. "I just do what I know," he replied. "That's all any of us can do." The investor smiled faintly. "Sometimes, that's more than enough." As the man walked away, Daniel locked up the shed and stepped into the cool night air. The world around him was unchanged, the same parking lot, the same company building, the same tools waiting for tomorrow's work. But something intangible had shifted. He had reminded powerful men and women that worth doesn't come from titles or expensive suits. It comes from action, from knowledge, from humility. The CEO, on the other hand, would never forget the humiliation of that afternoon. His investors had lost faith, his authority had cracked, and his arrogance had been exposed in front of all who mattered. His punishment wasn't delivered by Daniel's hands, but by his own hubris. And Daniel? He returned home to his modest apartment, greeted by the quiet comfort of a life lived authentically. He didn't need applause or headlines. He had his dignity, his integrity, and his craft. In a world obsessed with appearances, he carried something far rarer, the quiet power of a man who knew his worth without needing to prove it. That was his true victory. And that's how a humble janitor reminded a room full of powerful investors and an arrogant CEO that real worth isn't defined by titles, wealth, or appearance. In just 5 minutes, Daniel showed that knowledge, humility, and quiet confidence can outshine the loudest displays of arrogance. His story isn't just about fixing an engine, it's about fixing perceptions, breaking stereotypes, and proving that true power often comes from the most unexpected places. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Daniel's shoes, would you have stepped forward or stayed silent? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective makes this community stronger. If this story inspired you, don't miss the next one. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us in celebrating tales where the underestimated rise and justice always finds its way. Because sometimes, it only takes 5 minutes to change everything.